Okay, now let's take a look at some of the mobile device risks. Here are four security risks of mobile devices. It's all about where the vulnerabilities are. They're in the mobile device itself. That's the first item. There's mobile device vulnerabilities. But there's also vulnerabilities in how we connect, the connection vulnerabilities. Also, there's some risk with respect to accessing untrusted content. And lastly, we also see risk in how we implement deployment models. So let's take a look at these. First of all, we have physical security. And the few statistics listed here. The first bullet says about 68%, that's two-thirds of all healthcare security breaches were the result of the loss or theft of a mobile device. It seems that there isn't a week that goes by that we don't hear of yet another data breach happening. More often than not, it's because somebody's laptop got stolen and it had either unauthorized information stored on it in the form of personally identifiable information, or it was a legitimate laptop with the hard drive encrypted and it was still stolen. 1/4 of all laptop thefts occur from unattended cars or while traveling on airplanes and trains. 15% occurred in airports and hotels, 12% stolen from restaurants. Of course, these data are all pre-coronavirus when we were traveling, but you can see that wherever people gathered, this was a happy hunting ground for would-be thieves who would steal these laptops, or laptops that are just left by accident and are picked up by somebody else. Users must also guard against shoulder surfing, strangers who want to view sensitive information. Be always very mindful of the sensitive nature of the information you're viewing and the surroundings that you happen to find yourself in, the environment. Are there people looking over your shoulder? Are there cameras around that can see your screen? These are all aspects of physical security that come to play when we are talking about mobile devices. Also, there's some issues with limited firmware updates. Take a look at Apple and Google. In the first bullet, we're talking about the Apple iOS. This is a closed and proprietary architecture. So there's a certain amount of security that's inherent in that because Apple maintains central control of what goes onto their what goes into their ecosystem, as they say. So users update their iOS through iTunes or through OTA updates called firmware OTA updates or over-the-air updates. Google does it differently. Google does not create the hardware that Android runs on. In other words, they don't own the entire ecosystem as Apple does. So it's a much harder problem for them to distribute security updates to the devices through wireless carriers. It's going to machines that they don't control. So many OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, had modified the Android operating system, and now they're reluctant to distribute the updates because it might conflict with the changes they made to it. That's one reason why we see that reluctance and why there are more issues perhaps on the Google type, or Android phones I should say, that run the Google operating system. Wireless carriers also need to perform extensive testing. OEMs and wireless carriers are hesitant to distribute these Google updates, again out of fear that there's going to be problems or they're going to crash something. And lastly, there's really no financial incentive to update mobile devices. Again, they don't, Google does not own all these Android phones. There's a bunch of different manufacturers, again, unlike Apple that owns the whole ecosystem. So if the phone is working fine and there's been no reported problems, what incentive is there for the devices to upgrade, have their firmware update? It might be that they can't update their firmware to the latest OS from Google, in which case the user might be presented with an unusable phone once the firmware update is brought in. So let's talk about location tracking. This is an aspect of mobile devices as well. We've got mobile devices that use GPS to support something called geolocation. What is geolocation? Well, as the name implies, you're using this system, GPS, to find the phone, the geographical location of the device. In the simulation that you're going to do this week, you're actually going to run through and use the Find My Phone app on an Android device. Mobile devices using location services are at an increased risk of targeted physical attacks. So why is that? I mean, you'd think this is a good thing. Well, it is, but it's also got this downside. Attackers can determine where their users are and plan to steal the mobile device or inflict harm on them. GPS tagging. This is adding geographical identification data to media. It's also called geotagging. If you have Google Photos, the Google Photos app installed on your smartphone, you'll see that if you enable it, you can get geotagging. So it not only captures the date and time that the photo was taken and embeds it in the image, it also tags it with the location as to where this picture was snapped. Unauthorized recording is yet another concern. Basic precautions against this. How do you avoid it? Well, don't use a webcam in any room where private activities take place. It could be as simple as placing a piece of electrical tape over the lens of a webcam when it's not in use. Also, you should only allow permission to access the camera or microphone for apps that require it to be able to use it. So think about that for a minute. If you had an email application and it wants to access your webcam, you should think twice about permitting that access. What possible reason would it have? Well, there might be some circumstance where you'd use the phone to embed, use the camera to embed an image in an email, but probably not all the time. So maybe you select, if it's an iPhone, you can select the only when using the app, or you could just specifically enable it for the event that you need it. So you should periodically review the app permissions on your device and turn off those permissions that are not necessary. So this is again hearkening back to the concept that we talked about before, the principle of least privilege. You should turn off permissions that aren't necessary to lower the possible attack surface. So what are the connection vulnerabilities? I mentioned tethering. Tethering is when you have a mobile device with an active internet connection that can be used to share that connection with other mobile devices. So suppose you have an iPhone, and that iPhone uses Verizon as the internet service provider. So that's available since you have a cellular access to via Verizon. You can then use that iPhone to provide an internet connection to another device. Maybe you're in your car, you're traveling, and you've got an iPhone, and one of your passengers in the car has a Chromebook that needs access to the internet. They could tether off your iPhone. The vulnerability, though, is an unsecured mobile device may infect other tethered mobile devices or the computer network. So if I had, instead of an iPhone, let's say I had an Android phone and I was tethering off it, but that Android phone had malware on it, it's possible that the computers that connect to it when I'm tethering could also get that virus. So USB on the go, this is another technology you may not be aware of. This is when a mobile device that has a USB connection can act as either a host or peripheral used for external media access. So that's kind of like tethering, only it's hardwired through a USB connection called OTG, or on the go. The vulnerability here is connecting a mobile device as a peripheral to an infected computer could again allow malware to spread. So it's very similar to what we saw up here with tethering. And lastly, connecting to public networks, well, that's always problematic. Mobile devices must at the time use public external networks for internet access. So the problem is the networks are beyond the control of the organization, so attackers can eavesdrop, man-in-the-middle vulnerabilities, and they could potentially download and view sensitive information. So the next risk we saw with mobile devices on the list at the beginning of this video was accessing untrusted content. How can that happen? Accessing untrusted content. Well, there's a number of ways. Perhaps you're familiar with the QR codes or quick response codes. what are they? They're these. This is what a QR code looks like on the next slide. You're all probably familiar with this. You just scan this with your phone's camera and it'll automatically send you to a website. Well, what if that website is malicious? Apple now has a stopgap where when you do this, before it sends you, it'll ask you, do you want to go to, and give you a chance to interrupt the process. But what is this QR code? That's the two-dimensional barcode that can be read by an imaging device. So these have legitimate purposes. They're used for product tracking, item identification, time tracking, document management, and general marketing. How can they be abused? Well, an attacker can create an advertisement listing a reputable website but include a QR code that goes to a malicious URL. So what happens is the code directs a user's browser to the attacker's imposter website or to a site that downloads malware. Another risk is that users can circumvent the built-in protections on smartphones to download from unofficial third-party app stores. Unofficial. This is known as side loading. They're not going through the established, authorized route to get their apps. You can't do that normally on an Apple iPhone. They won't permit it. You can only download stuff from the App Store unless you jailbreak the phone. Jailbreaking on an Apple iOS devices. You could do the same thing on Android. It's called a different name though. It's called rooting to refer to like getting root access. So you don't want to do this because you're basically subverting the security controls that might be on the device to download potentially malicious software when you sideload. So let's talk about short message service, SMS. These are text messages limited to 160 characters. There's also MMS. So that's multimedia thrown in there in addition to the text. This could include pictures, video, or audio. Here's the problem. Threat actors can send SMS messages that contain links to untrusted content or send a specially crafted MMS, the multimedia video, that can introduce malware into the device. Lastly, we're going to see that there are so-called deployment model risks that come with mobile devices. What are these? Well, they're at the enterprise level. We talked about what those models were before, remember? The BYOD, the CYOD, the COPE, the corporate owned, the VDI. Well, it turns out that even with these deployment models, users may erase the installed built-in limitations of their mobile device, effectively circumventing or disabling the built-in security features. Why would they do that? Well, they might do it knowingly, but more likely it's because they want to put some authorized app on the phone that they want to use. Maybe it's, TikTok or Instagram or something that's not on the list, on the white list of approved apps for their business phone. So personal mobile devices are often shared among family members and friends, subjecting sensitive corporate data installed on a user's device to outsiders. So that's a huge problem. You don't want to, if you're an employee of an enterprise that has authorized the use of mobile devices to do business, you should not be sharing it with other family members and friends, because then you lose control as to what they're doing on it and potentially accessing sensitive data, and that could lead in a leak of proprietary information, or worse than that, even a data breach of HIPAA type information protected by federal law. Thirdly, we have different mobile devices have different hardware and OSs that technical support staff might have to support. So this is a problem with like BYOD, where or even in the CYOD, because you have maybe a whole menu of possible smartphones that now your IT staff has to support. So the more complexity you have, the harder it is to manage. The more time it requires, the more money is required to maintain it. I mean, you can see this kind of thing happening right now during the corona quarantines, where, yeah, you can still go to McDonald's, but they're limiting their menu. They can't afford the staff to be able to do all this during these difficult times, so they scale it down. So it's the same kind of idea here. You would like to have a minimal set that would be easier to maintain. Lastly, it might be difficult securing the personal smartphone from an employee who has left the company. So you have to have some kind of mechanism in place, an administrative mechanism, to ensure that you recover that smartphone when you lose a employee for whatever reason. So that concludes this objective, talking about the risks associated with mobile devices. Now we're going to move on in the next video to talk about how we secure them.